The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Millbrook as 17-year-old Clara Thompson swept the front steps of Henderson's General Store. Her calloused hands gripped the worn broom handle, evidence of 3 years spent, working dawn to dusk to help her family survive. The faded blue dress she wore had been mended so many times that patches covered patches, but Clara carried herself with a dignity that poverty couldn't diminish. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Judge Marcus Whitfield's black carriage rounded the corner, its polished exterior gleaming like a predator's eyes in the morning light. Clara's stomach clenched as she recognized the distinctive brass fittings and matched a pair of bay horses. The judge never came to this part of town unless he wanted something, and lately his wants had become increasingly focused on her. "Clara, get inside," her mother's voice carried from the store's doorway, tight with fear that had become their family's constant companion since her father's death 6 months ago. But it was too late. The carriage had stopped directly in front of the store, and Judge Whitfield's imposing figure emerged. At 45, he commanded respect through fear rather than admiration. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his black suit immaculate, and his cold grey eyes held the calculating look of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. "Miss Thompson," he said, tipping his hat with mock politeness, "how lovely you look this morning." Clara kept her eyes downcast, knowing that meeting his gaze would only encourage him. "Good morning, Judge Whitfield. I trust you've given thought to our previous conversation." His voice carried the weight of authority, the same tone he used when pronouncing sentences from his bench. The previous conversation. Clara's hands tightened on the broom as she remembered his visit 2 weeks ago. He had cornered her behind the store while she hung laundry, his breath reeking of whiskey as he explained how a marriage between them would solve all her family's financial troubles. When she had stammered a refusal, his face had darkened with the kind of rage that sent grown men scrambling from his courtroom. "I haven't changed my mind, sir," Clara said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Judge Whitfield's expression hardened. "Perhaps you need more time to consider the alternatives." He gestured toward the store where Clara's mother stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale with terror. "Your family owes considerable debts to several prominent businessmen in town, debts that could be called in at any moment." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Clara knew their situation was desperate. Without her father's income from the silver mine, they had fallen behind on everything. The store owner had been patient, but patience had limits. The doctor, who had treated her father's final illness, still expected payment. Even the preacher had begun making pointed comments about overdue church donations. "My mother and brother need me," Clara said, lifting her chin with a courage she didn't feel. "I can't abandon them." "Abandon them?" Judge Whitfield's laugh was cold as a winter wind. "My dear girl, marriage to me would elevate your entire family. Your mother would want for nothing, and your brother could attend the finest schools back east. You'd be doing them a tremendous service." Clara's younger brother Danny chose that moment to appear around the corner, his 11-year-old face bright with the kind of innocence that poverty hadn't yet managed to steal. He carried a fishing pole and a can of worms, clearly planning to spend the morning at the creek that ran behind the town. "Clara," he called out cheerfully, "Ma said I could go fishing if I finished my chores. Want to come with me?" The judge's cold eyes fixed on Danny with predatory interest. "Such a fine boy," he said softly. "It would be a shame if something were to happen to his future prospects. I understand the territorial prison is always in need of workers for their road crews. Dangerous work, especially for someone so young." The implication was clear, and Clara felt ice form in her veins. Judge Whitfield had the power to destroy her family in countless ways. He could foreclose on their debts, have Danny arrested on trumped-up charges, or simply make life in Millbrook impossible through 1,000 small cruelties. "You have until Sunday to give me your answer," the judge continued, his voice returning to its mock-pleasant tone. "I've already spoken to Reverend Morrison about performing the ceremony. Such a lovely time of year for a wedding, don't you think?" Sunday was only 4 days away. Clara's mother stepped forward, her hands trembling as she wiped them on her apron. "Judge Whitfield, surely there's another way to settle our accounts. Clara is just a child, barely 17, old enough to be married in the eyes of God and the law," he replied curtly, "and young enough to learn proper obedience to her husband. I've been more than patient with your family's circumstances, Mrs. Thompson. My offer represents a generous solution to problems that could otherwise become quite unpleasant." Danny had stopped playing with his fishing line, sensing the tension in the adult conversation, even if he didn't fully understand it. His young face showed confusion as he looked between his mother's frightened expression and Clara's pale complexion. "What's wrong, Ma?" he asked, moving closer to Clara's side. "Nothing, sweetheart," Clara said quickly, putting a protective arm around his shoulders. "Just grown-up talk." Judge Whitfield smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. "Indeed, grown-up decisions that affect the whole family." He pulled out an ornate pocket watch, checking the time with deliberate precision. "I have court proceedings to attend, but I'll expect your answer by Sunday morning. The ceremony could take place that very afternoon, if you're sensible about this." As his carriage pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake, Clara felt the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. Her mother sagged against the doorframe, looking older than her 42 years. "We'll find another way," Clara said firmly, though she had no idea what that way might be. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Clara, what choice do we have? The Hendersons have been kind about letting us stay in the back room, but they can't carry us forever, and Judge Whitfield, he's not a man who accepts no for an answer." That evening, as Clara helped her mother prepare their meager dinner, she learned more about their true situation. The debts were even worse than she had imagined. Her father's medical bills alone exceeded $200, an impossible sum for a family surviving on Clara's $3 weekly wages from the general store. "Your father was proud," her mother said softly, stirring a pot of thin soup that would have to suffice for all 3 of them. "He never wanted you children to know how bad things had gotten. The mine owners promised compensation for his injury, but after he died," she shrugged helplessly. "Promises don't put food on the table." Danny burst through the back door, his fishing expedition successful, judging by the 3 small trout he carried. "Look what I caught. We can have a real meal tonight." Clara's heart ached at his excitement over such a small victory. At 11, Danny should have been worrying about school lessons and boyish adventures, not whether his family would have enough to eat. Their father's death had forced him to grow up too quickly, taking on odd jobs around town whenever he could find them. "That's wonderful, Danny," she said, ruffling his dark hair. "You're quite the fisherman." As they cleaned the fish together, Danny chattered about his day. He had seen some Apache riders in the distance while fishing, he told them excitedly. They had been too far away to make out details, but their horses were painted with war designs. "You stay away from the creek if there are Apache around," their mother said sharply, fear immediately replacing the brief contentment that Danny's catch had brought. "They weren't bothering nobody, Ma," Danny protested. "Just riding along the ridge like they owned the place." "They probably do own it," Clara said quietly. "We're the ones who came to their land." Her mother shot her a warning look. Such sentiments were dangerous in a town where Indian raids were blamed for everything from missing livestock to bad weather. But Clara had always wondered about the Apache, people who occasionally appeared on the surrounding mesas. Unlike the townspeople's stories of savage warriors, the distant figures she sometimes glimpsed seemed to move with purpose and dignity across landscapes they clearly understood better than any settler. That night, Clara lay awake on her thin mattress, listening to Danny's peaceful breathing and her mother's occasional soft sobs. Through the small window, she could see stars scattered across the desert sky like diamonds on black velvet. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of Judge Whitfield's influence, people lived free lives governed by their own choices. She thought about her father's stories of life back in Missouri, where he had met her mother. They had been young and in love, full of dreams about building a life together in the West. Those dreams had died slowly, eroded by harsh realities and broken promises, until only survival remained. Clara refused to let her dreams die the same way. The next morning brought news that made their situation even more desperate. Mr. Henderson appeared at their door before dawn, his usually kind face grave with reluctance. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thompson," he said, wringing his hands, "but I've had a visit from Judge Whitfield. He's made it clear that continuing to employ Clara or house your family could be problematic for my business." Clara's mother sank into a chair, the color draining from her face. "When do we need to leave?" "End of the week," Henderson said miserably. "He's given me no choice in the matter. Said something about needing to help the Thompson family understand their options more clearly." After Henderson left, Clara made a decision that surprised even herself. She would not spend the remaining days cowering in fear, waiting for Sunday's deadline. If Judge Whitfield wanted to play games with her family's survival, she would learn everything she could about the man who held their fate in his hands. That afternoon, she made her way to the courthouse under the pretense of delivering a message for Mr. Henderson. The imposing stone building represented law and order to most townspeople, but to Clara, it felt like a fortress designed to keep ordinary people at a safe distance from real power. Judge Whitfield held court 3 days a week, and Clara timed her arrival to coincide with the afternoon session. She slipped into the back row of the gallery, keeping her head down, as she observed the man who wanted to control her life. What she saw chilled her to the bone. Judge Whitfield dispensed justice with cruel efficiency, showing particular harshness toward anyone he deemed beneath his social station. She watched him sentence a Mexican laborer to 6 months of hard labor for allegedly stealing a chicken worth 50 cents. When the man's wife began crying, the judge threatened to charge her with disturbing the peace. A young Apache man stood accused of trespassing on private property. The evidence was thin. He had been seen near a ranch where cattle had gone missing, but Judge Whitfield's verdict was swift and severe. 2 years in the territorial prison, to be served at hard labor on the road crews. "Let this be a lesson," the judge intoned from his bench, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "We will not tolerate savage incursions into civilized territory. The safety of our citizens depends on swift and decisive action against all threats to the established order." Clara noticed how the judge's eyes lingered on her during his pronouncement, as if the words were meant for her as much as the defendant. When court adjourned, she hurried from the building, her mind reeling with what she had witnessed. That evening, she shared her observations with her mother, carefully omitting the most disturbing details to avoid causing additional distress. But one thing had become crystal clear. Judge Whitfield was not merely a powerful man accustomed to getting his way. He was a man who enjoyed exercising power over those who couldn't fight back. Thursday brought another unwelcome visitor. Sheriff Tom Bradley appeared at their door just after breakfast, his badge gleaming in the morning sun. Unlike the judge, Bradley had always been fair in his dealings with the Thompson family, but today his expression was troubled. "Clara, I need to speak with you," he said, glancing nervously around as if expecting to be overheard. They walked to the edge of town, where Bradley finally turned to face her with obvious reluctance. "I've known your family since you arrived in Millbrook," he began. "Your father was a good man, and you've conducted yourself with honor despite your hardships." Clara waited, sensing that worse news was coming. Judge Whitfield has made certain requests regarding Sunday's ceremony, Bradley continued, his voice heavy with distaste. He's asked me to ensure that the proceedings go smoothly, without any disruptions or attempts to leave town. The implication was clear. Clara was to be watched, prevented from running away before the forced marriage could take place. Even Sheriff Bradley, who clearly disapproved of the situation, felt powerless to oppose the judge's authority. "What if I refuse?" Clara asked quietly. Bradley's expression grew pained. "He's prepared legal documents charging your family with theft, fraud, and conspiracy. Says he has evidence that your father embezzled money from the mining company before his death. It's not true. We both know that, but he's the judge," Clara finished. "His word against ours." Bradley nodded miserably. "I'm sorry, Clara. I truly am. If there was anything I could do—" That night, Clara made a desperate plan. If she couldn't escape the town, perhaps she could at least ensure her family's safety by removing herself from the equation entirely. The creek where Danny liked to fish ran for miles through Apache territory. If she could reach it before dawn and follow it far enough from town, maybe she could disappear entirely. It was a dangerous plan with little chance of success, but it was the only option that didn't involve surrendering to Judge Whitfield's demands. Friday arrived grey and overcast, matching Clara's mood as she went through the motions of normal daily activities while secretly preparing for her escape attempt. She gathered what few possessions she could carry without arousing suspicion: her father's small hunting knife, a tin cup, and the worn Bible that had belonged to her grandmother. As evening approached, Clara found herself studying every detail of her mother's face, memorizing the way Danny's eyes crinkled when he laughed. If her plan failed, she might never see them again. If it succeeded, the separation might be just as permanent. Saturday brought news that shattered even this desperate hope. Sheriff Bradley appeared at their door again, but this time he wasn't alone. 2 deputies flanked him, their expressions apologetic but determined. "I'm sorry, Clara," Bradley said, "but I've been ordered to ensure you remain in town until after tomorrow's ceremony. You'll be staying at the jail tonight for your own protection." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The jail cell was small and cold, with a single window that offered a view of the surrounding desert. As Clara sat on the hard cot, watching the sun set over the distant mesas, she felt the last of her options slip away like sand through her fingers. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear, mocking Clara's despair with its beauty. Sheriff Bradley brought her a basin of water and a dress that Judge Whitfield had purchased for the occasion, white silk that probably cost more than her family earned in 3 months. "He wants you to look proper for the ceremony," Bradley said. Unable to meet her eyes, Clara stared at the expensive dress with revulsion. It represented everything she despised about her situation: the judge's wealth, his power to control every detail of her life, his assumption that she could be bought and dressed up like a doll for his amusement. As she reluctantly changed into the silk gown, Clara caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. The dress fit perfectly, which somehow made everything worse. Judge Whitfield had clearly taken measurements from her everyday clothes, planning this moment with meticulous attention to detail. At precisely 11 o'clock, Sheriff Bradley opened the cell door. "It's time," he said simply. The walk to the church felt like a funeral procession. Clara moved as if in a dream, her feet carrying her forward, while her mind refused to accept what was happening. Townspeople lined the streets, some watching with sympathy, others with curiosity, a few with the kind of satisfaction that came from witnessing someone else's misfortune. The church bells were ringing as they approached the white wooden building where Clara had attended services since childhood. Today, those same bells seemed to toll her doom. Inside, the church was filled with the town's most prominent citizens, all dressed in their finest clothes as if this were a celebration rather than a tragedy. Judge Whitfield stood at the altar, in an expensive black suit, his silver hair gleaming in the colored light that streamed through the stained-glass windows. Clara's mother and Danny sat in the front pew, their faces pale with shared anguish. Danny kept looking toward the door, as if expecting rescue to arrive at any moment. Her mother's hands were folded in prayer, though Clara wondered what kind of God would allow such an injustice to unfold in his own house. Reverend Morrison stood beside the judge, his usually warm face troubled as he prepared to perform a ceremony that violated every principle of Christian marriage. He had baptized Clara as a baby, confirmed her faith as a young girl, and now he would be forced to bind her to a man who represented everything cruel and corrupt in their world. As Clara reached the altar, Judge Whitfield extended his hand with a satisfied smile. His fingers were cold and soft, the hands of a man who had never done honest work. When he spoke, his voice carried across the church with absolute authority. "My dear friends," he began, "we gather today to witness the union of two souls in holy matrimony. Miss Clara Thompson has graciously agreed to become my wife, and I am honored to welcome her into the distinguished Whitfield family." Clara's hands trembled as she stood beside him, the white silk dress feeling like a shroud around her young body. Every word of the ceremony would be a lie, every vow a mockery of everything marriage was supposed to represent. Reverend Morrison opened his Bible with obvious reluctance, his voice barely above a whisper as he began the traditional words. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." The church door exploded inward with a crash that echoed like thunder. The Apache warrior who burst through the church doors moved with deadly grace, his buckskin clothing adorned with intricate beadwork that caught the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows. His long black hair was bound with leather strips decorated with eagle feathers, and war paint marked his high cheekbones in patterns that spoke of honor and courage. But it was his eyes that commanded attention. Dark as storm clouds, they swept across the congregation with intelligent assessment before fixing on Judge Whitfield with unmistakable contempt. In his right hand, he carried a tomahawk whose steel blade gleamed with razor sharpness. His left hand held something that made several townspeople gasp in recognition: legal papers, official documents bearing territorial seals. "This ceremony will not proceed," the warrior announced, his English clear and precise despite a slight accent that marked him as someone who had learned the language rather than being born to it. "I am Joseph Crow Feather of the Chiricahua Apache, and I carry orders from the territorial governor himself." Judge Whitfield's face had gone deathly pale, but his voice remained steady as he addressed the intruder. "This is a house of God, savage. You have no authority here." Joseph Crow Feather's smile was as cold as winter wind. "I have more authority than you imagine, Judge Whitfield. These papers grant me the power to investigate territorial corruption and crimes against indigenous peoples. Your trial of my cousin 3 days ago was conducted in violation of federal treaty law." The congregation erupted in confused murmurs. Clara found herself frozen between relief and terror, uncertain whether this unexpected intervention represented salvation or simply a different kind of danger. The Apache warrior's presence filled the church with an energy that made the air itself seem to crackle with tension. Sheriff Bradley had drawn his weapon, but he hesitated to aim it at a man carrying official government documents. "What exactly are you claiming?" he asked, his voice tight with uncertainty. Joseph reached into a leather pouch at his side and withdrew additional papers, spreading them across the altar where everyone could see the official seals and signatures. Thomas Running Bear was convicted of cattle theft based on perjured testimony from witnesses who were paid by Marcus Whitfield. The federal marshal's investigation has uncovered evidence of systematic corruption in this court. Judge Whitfield's composure cracked slightly. Preposterous accusations from a savage who would say anything to free his criminal kinsman. Then you won't mind answering questions about the $3,000 you received from the cattlemen's association 2 days before my cousin's trial, Joseph replied smoothly, or explaining why witnesses who testified against Apache defendants always seem to receive generous loans from your private bank account. The warrior's knowledge of specific details sent a ripple of shock through the assembled townspeople. This was not a random raid or act of vengeance. Someone with access to court records and financial documents had been conducting a thorough investigation of Judge Whitfield's activities. Clara watched as the man who had seemed so powerful and untouchable just moments before began to show signs of genuine fear. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air, and his hands trembled slightly as he gestured dismissively at the documents. Even if these wild accusations contained any truth, the judge said, they have nothing to do with today's proceedings. Miss Thompson has agreed to become my wife of her own free will. Joseph Crow Feather turned his penetrating gaze to Clara for the first time, and she felt as if he could see directly into her soul. His expression softened almost, imperceptibly, as he took in her youth, her obvious distress, and the way she held herself like someone braced for a blow. "Is this true?" he asked her gently. "Will you enter this marriage willingly?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire. Clara was acutely aware that her answer would determine not just her own fate, but possibly the lives of her mother and brother. Judge Whitfield's eyes bored into her with threatening intensity, reminding her of all the ways he could destroy her family if she defied him now. But there was something in the Apache warrior's presence that gave her courage. She hadn't known she possessed. Perhaps it was the way he stood completely at ease, despite being outnumbered 50-1, or the calm confidence in his voice as he challenged the most powerful man in the territory. Whatever the source, Clara found her voice. "No," she said, clearly. "I do not marry willingly. Judge Whitfield has threatened to destroy my family if I refuse. My mother and brother will starve or face imprisonment if I don't submit to his demands." The admission sent another wave of murmurs through the congregation. Several townspeople shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of the judge's reputation, but unwilling to challenge him openly. Others looked genuinely shocked, as if Clara's words had stripped away illusions they had maintained about their community's moral character. Judge Whitfield's face flushed with rage. "Ungrateful child, I offered your family salvation from poverty and disgrace. This savage has filled your head with lies and false hope." "The only lies in this church come from you," Joseph replied. His voice remained calm, but Clara noticed how his grip on the tomahawk shifted slightly, ready for violence if necessary. "Forced marriage is illegal under both territorial and federal law. This young woman is being coerced through threats against her family." Sheriff Bradley found his voice. "Now hold on. Judge Whitfield is a respected member of this community. You can't just barge in here with wild accusations and disrupt a legal ceremony." Joseph reached into his shirt and withdrew a leather folder containing additional documents. "Then perhaps you'll be interested in these warrants. Marcus Whitfield is wanted for questioning in federal court regarding corruption, extortion, and violations of the Indian Removal Act. Any attempt to complete this marriage ceremony while these charges are pending would constitute obstruction of justice." The papers he displayed bore the unmistakable seal of the territorial governor's office. Sheriff Bradley examined them with growing concern, his face reflecting the realization that the situation had moved far beyond his ability to control. Judge Whitfield made a desperate play for authority. "Thomas, you know me. We've worked together. For years, are you going to take the word of a savage over a fellow white man? This is obviously some elaborate Apache trick to undermine law and order in our territory. But Sheriff Bradley had spent enough time studying the documents to recognize their authenticity. I'm sorry, Marcus. These papers appear legitimate. I can't allow this ceremony to continue until these matters are resolved in federal court. The admission sent shockwaves through the congregation. If Sheriff Bradley, Judge Whitfield's longtime ally, was acknowledging the validity of the charges, then the foundations of power in Millbrook were shifting beneath everyone's feet. Clara felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. The immediate threat of forced marriage had been lifted, but she understood that Judge Whitfield would not accept this humiliation quietly. Men like him didn't forgive public challenges to their authority, especially when those challenges came from people they considered inferior. As if reading her thoughts, Joseph Crow Feather stepped closer to where she stood. "Miss Thompson, are you and your family in immediate danger if you remain in this town?" Before Clara could answer, Judge Whitfield snarled, "Savage, you've made a grave error. When these charges are proven false, and they will be, I'll see that. You hang for disrupting the peace and threatening a federal judge." "Federal judges don't threaten young women into marriage," Joseph replied coolly, "and they don't take bribes from cattle barons to convict innocent men." The confrontation had reached a tipping point. Clara could see desperation creeping into Judge Whitfield's expression as he realized that his carefully constructed world of corruption and intimidation was collapsing around him. Men like him were most dangerous when cornered. Joseph seemed to recognize the same warning signs. He moved closer to Clara, positioning himself between her and the judge while keeping his attention divided between multiple potential threats in the crowded church. "Sheriff Bradley," he said formally, "I'm placing this young woman and her family under federal protection, pending the resolution of these charges. Any attempt to harm or intimidate them will be considered an assault on federal authority." Clara's mother had remained silent throughout the confrontation, clutching Danny's hand as she watched her daughter's fate being decided by forces beyond her understanding. Now she found her voice. "Clara, what does this mean? Are we safe?" It was Joseph who answered. "Ma'am, your daughter showed tremendous courage in speaking the truth today. The federal government has been investigating corruption in territorial courts for months. Your family's testimony could be crucial in ensuring that justice is served." Judge Whitfield's laugh was bitter and harsh. "Justice? You speak of justice while threatening established order with savage interference. Mark my words, this territory will not tolerate Apache arrogance for long." The threat in his words was unmistakable, but Joseph remained unshaken. "The only arrogance I see is from a man who believes his position places him above the law. That arrogance ends today." As the immediate crisis seemed to stabilize, Clara began to process what had just happened. A complete stranger had risked his life to prevent her forced marriage, armed with knowledge and authority that suggested careful planning and investigation. But why would an Apache warrior involve himself in the troubles of a poor white family? The answer came when Joseph addressed the congregation one final time. "Let this be understood by all present. The Apache people seek justice, not vengeance. We have suffered under corrupt officials who violate treaties and persecute innocent people for personal gain. When we see such corruption directed against any person, regardless of their heritage, we will stand for what is right." His words carried the weight of formal declaration, as if he were speaking not just for himself, but for his entire people. Clara realized that her personal crisis had become part of a much larger struggle between justice and corruption, between those who sought power through fear and those who demanded accountability under law. Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat nervously. "What happens now? I mean, practically speaking, what's the next step in all this?" Joseph consulted his documents. "Federal marshals are en route to Millbrook. They should arrive within the week to begin formal proceedings. Until then, Judge Whitfield will refrain from any judicial activities, and the Thompson family will remain under protective custody. Protective custody? Clara asked, uncertain whether this represented freedom or simply a different kind of confinement. You'll be safe, Joseph assured her. There are people in this territory who believe in justice for all its citizens, not just the wealthy and powerful. Your courage in speaking the truth today has given those people the ammunition they need to fight corruption. Judge Whitfield had been listening to this exchange with growing fury. Now he stepped forward, his voice dripping with venomous authority. This farce has gone far enough. Thomas, arrest this savage for disturbing the peace and making false accusations. Against a territorial official, Sheriff Bradley found himself caught between conflicting authorities, his face reflecting the difficulty of his position. The federal documents appeared legitimate, but Judge Whitfield still wielded considerable local power. Making the wrong choice could destroy his career or worse. Joseph resolved the sheriff's dilemma by producing one final document from his leather folder. Sheriff Bradley, you're hereby deputized as a federal officer for the duration of this investigation. Your authority comes directly from Washington, not from any territorial appointment. The paper he handed over bore official seals that even Judge Whitfield couldn't dispute. Sheriff Bradley studied it carefully before nodding with obvious relief. Well then, I guess that settles it. Judge Whitfield, you're officially suspended from your duties pending federal investigation. The pronouncement sent a final shockwave through the assembled townspeople. Many had never imagined they would witness the downfall of someone as powerful as Judge Whitfield. Others seemed frightened by the implications, uncertain what would happen to established order if corrupt officials could be challenged and removed. Clara felt overwhelmed by the rapid transformation of her circumstances. Hours ago, she had been a helpless victim facing forced marriage to a cruel man. Now she stood protected by federal authority, her testimony potentially crucial in bringing down a corrupt system that had oppressed many people for years. But with this newfound hope came new uncertainties. What would happen to her family now? Where would they live? How would they survive without Judge Whitfield's threats hanging over them, but also without the terrible security those threats had provided? Joseph Crow Feather seemed to sense her confusion. As the congregation began to disperse, murmuring among themselves about the morning's unprecedented events, he approached Clara with respectful caution. Miss Thompson, I know this has been overwhelming. Change often feels dangerous, even when it leads toward justice, but I want you to understand something important. He paused, choosing his words carefully. What happened here today wasn't just about stopping one forced marriage or exposing one corrupt judge. It was about proving that people of conscience can stand together against injustice, regardless of their backgrounds or the color of their skin. Clara looked into his dark eyes and saw something she hadn't expected: genuine respect for her courage and recognition of her worth as a human being. In Judge Whitfield's eyes, she had property to be acquired. In Joseph's eyes, she was a person whose choices mattered. "What happens to my family now?" she asked quietly. "That depends partly on what you want to happen," Joseph replied. "The federal investigation will need your testimony, but beyond that, your future is your own to choose. There are people who will help you build a new life, one based on freedom rather than fear." As they prepared to leave the church, Clara caught sight of Judge Whitfield's face one final time. The rage and hatred in his expression promised that this confrontation was far from over. Powerful men didn't accept defeat gracefully, especially when that defeat came at the hands of people they considered inferior. But for the first time in months, Clara felt hope burning in her chest like a warming fire. Whatever challenges lay ahead, She would face them as a free person, not as a victim of circumstances beyond her control. The morning sun seemed brighter as they walked from the church, and Clara allowed herself to imagine a future where her choices were her own to make. 3 days after the disrupted wedding ceremony, Clara found herself in circumstances she could never have imagined. The federal marshals had arrived as promised, establishing temporary headquarters in the town's hotel while they conducted their investigation. Judge Whitfield had been placed under house arrest, his assets frozen pending the outcome of corruption charges that seemed to multiply daily as more evidence surfaced. Clara and her family had been relocated to a small cabin on the outskirts of town, provided by sympathetic townspeople who had quietly supported the federal intervention. For the first time in months, they had adequate food, warm beds, and most importantly, freedom from the constant fear that had dominated their lives. Joseph Crowfeather had remained in Millbrook as a liaison between the federal investigators and the Apache Tribal Council. His presence had initially caused considerable tension among the townspeople, but his knowledge of territorial law and his calm demeanor had gradually earned grudging respect from even the most prejudiced residents. Clara discovered that Joseph was far more complex than the fierce warrior who had burst into the church. Educated at a mission school in his youth, he spoke fluent English and Spanish, in addition to his native Apache language. More surprisingly, he had studied law at a college in California before returning to his people to serve as an advocate for their rights in territorial courts. Your education explains why you knew so much about Judge Whitfield's corruption, Clara said, as they walked along the creek, where Danny liked to fish. Joseph had offered to escort her on errands, partly for protection and partly because the federal marshals wanted to keep potential witnesses safe from intimidation. Education was my father's idea, Joseph replied, watching the water flow over smooth stones. He believed that to protect our people from unjust laws, we needed to understand how those laws worked. Most tribal leaders focus on traditional ways of resistance. My father thought we also needed warriors who could fight with words and legal documents. Clara had never heard anyone speak about education as a form of warfare, but the concept made sense, given what she had witnessed. It must have been difficult, being away from your people for so long. Joseph's expression grew thoughtful. The most difficult part was learning to see through the eyes of two cultures. In the white world, I was always an Apache, never quite trusted or accepted. Among my people, some viewed my education with suspicion, wondering if I had been corrupted by white ways. They paused at a bend in the creek, where wildflowers grew in colorful profusion along the banks. Clara found herself studying Joseph's profile as he watched a hawk circle overhead. His features were strong and distinctive, marked by intelligence, and a strength that came from facing adversity with dignity rather than bitterness. "What made you decide to intervene in my situation?" she asked. "You were risking your life for strangers." Joseph turned to meet her gaze directly. "Injustice anywhere weakens justice everywhere. When powerful men abuse their authority, they make it easier for others to do the same. Judge Whitfield's corruption wasn't just harming Apache people, it was poisoning the entire territory." Clara understood that his intervention hadn't been motivated by romantic notions of rescuing a damsel in distress. It had been a calculated move in a larger struggle for justice and accountability. Somehow, this made his actions even more meaningful to her. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Danny came running toward them, his face flushed with excitement and alarm. "Clara, there's a whole bunch of riders coming into town. They don't look friendly and they're asking questions about the Apache who disrupted Judge Whitfield's wedding." Joseph's demeanor shifted instantly, the relaxed conversation partner replaced by the alert warrior Clara had first encountered. "How many riders? What did they look like?" "Maybe a dozen," Danny replied breathlessly. All armed, wearing the kind of clothes that make them look like they mean business. One of them had a badge, but it didn't look like Sheriff Bradley's. Clara felt a chill of premonition. Could they be more federal marshals? Joseph shook his head grimly. The federal investigation team is complete. These men are something else entirely. He began walking quickly toward town, Clara and Danny hurrying to keep pace. Danny, did you hear any of their conversation? Any names or specific questions? They were asking about you by name, Danny said. Joseph Crowfeather. And they wanted to know where the Thompson family was staying. Mr. Henderson told them he didn't know, but I could tell he was nervous. As they crested the hill overlooking Millbrook, Clara could see the riders gathered in front of the hotel, where the federal marshals were headquartered. Even from a distance, their posture suggested confrontation rather than cooperation. Joseph studied the scene with the tactical awareness of someone trained in warfare. These men aren't here to support the federal investigation. Someone sent them to interfere with it. Judge Whitfield? Clara asked, though she suspected the answer was more complicated. Whitfield is under house arrest, but he has powerful friends throughout the territory, men who profit from the kind of corruption we're exposing. They can't allow this investigation to succeed because it would threaten their own illegal activities. The implications were sobering. Clara had hoped that Judge Whitfield's downfall would end her family's troubles, but it seemed they had simply become part of a much larger conflict between competing power structures in the territory. Joseph made a decision that demonstrated both his strategic thinking and his personal courage. I need to get closer to hear what they're saying. Clara, take Danny back to your cabin and stay there until I return. If these men are looking for you, don't make it easy for them. What if they're looking for you? Clara asked, concerned for his safety. Joseph's smile was grim but confident. Then they'll find me, but on my terms, not theirs. As Clara and Danny retreated toward their cabin, Joseph melted into the landscape with the stealth that had served his people for generations. Clara marveled at how completely he seemed to disappear among the rocks and scrub brush, becoming invisible even though she knew approximately where he was. At the cabin, Clara's mother was waiting anxiously, having heard rumors from neighbors about the mysterious riders. What's happening, Clara? Are we in danger again? Clara explained what they had observed, trying to project calm confidence while battling her own growing fears. The temporary security they had enjoyed over the past few days now seemed fragile and possibly illusory. An hour later, Joseph appeared at their door so quietly that Clara jumped when she looked up to find him standing there. His expression was grave as he settled beside the table where the family had gathered. The riders are bounty hunters, he reported. They're led by a man named Jake Morrison, who specializes in tracking fugitives across territorial lines. Someone has convinced them that I'm wanted for federal crimes in connection with Apache raids in Arizona, Clara's mother gasped. But that's not true. You're working with the federal marshals. Truth and legality aren't always the same thing, Joseph replied. Morrison has what appears to be a legitimate warrant for my arrest. The federal marshals are reviewing it now, but if it's found to be valid, they'll have no choice but to turn me over to Morrison's custody. The situation was rapidly spinning beyond anyone's control. Clara realized that the forces opposing the corruption investigation were more powerful and better organized than she had imagined. They weren't simply trying to protect Judge Whitfield, they were systematically dismantling the entire federal case. What about us? Danny asked with the direct honesty of youth. If they take you away, what happens to our family? Joseph met the boy's gaze with respectful seriousness. Your family's federal protection remains in effect regardless of what happens to me. But I won't lie to you, my absence would make that protection harder to enforce. Clara found herself facing another impossible choice. Joseph's presence had given her family security and hope for the first time in months, but that presence was also putting them at risk from powerful enemies who would stop at nothing to preserve their corrupt system. There might be another option, she said slowly, an idea forming as she spoke. What if you didn't have to face Morrison's warrant alone? What if you had allies who could help expose the truth about these charges? Joseph studied her with interest. What are you thinking? The federal marshals must have ways to verify the authenticity of warrants. If Morrison's papers are forged or obtained through corruption, that would be evidence of obstruction of justice. But they'd need time to investigate, and Morrison won't give them that time unless he's forced to. Joseph's expression showed both admiration and concern. You're talking about deliberately putting yourself in danger to buy time for the truth to emerge. Clara, these men are killers. Morrison didn't build his reputation on bringing fugitives back alive. Then we need to make sure the truth comes out before anyone gets killed, Clara replied. You risked your life to save mine. Now it's my turn to help save yours. Her mother reached across the table to grasp Clara's hand. Sweetheart, what exactly are you proposing? Clara smiled at her brother's courage, remembering how frightened and helpless they had all felt just days ago. The crisis had revealed strength in all of them that they hadn't known they possessed. Joseph considered her proposal carefully. It would be dangerous for all of you. Morrison's men won't hesitate to hurt anyone who interferes with their plans. Judge Whitfield would have hurt us anyway, Clara pointed out. At least this way, we're choosing our own risks instead of having them forced on us. The conversation was interrupted by rapid knocking on the cabin door. Sheriff Bradley's voice called urgently from outside. Joseph, Clara, you need to hear this right away. Joseph opened the door cautiously, ready for trouble, but Bradley's expression showed excitement rather than alarm. The federal marshals have found something important. Morrison's warrant is legitimate, but it's for a different Joseph Crow Feather. A man who died in Arizona 6 months ago. Someone stole a dead man's identity to create false charges against you. The revelation changed everything. Morrison wasn't just a bounty hunter pursuing a fugitive. He was part of an elaborate conspiracy to remove Joseph from the corruption investigation through fraudulent legal means. This is the evidence we needed, Joseph said, his voice tight, with controlled anger. Morrison and whoever sent him have just committed federal crimes that carry serious prison sentences. Clara felt a surge of hope, but she also recognized that the danger had not passed. Desperate men with powerful backers wouldn't give up simply because their first plan had failed. "Oh, what happens now?" she asked. Sheriff Bradley's grim smile provided part of the answer. "Now we spring our own trap. The federal marshals want to use this false warrant as bait to expose the entire conspiracy, but they'll need everyone's cooperation to make it work." As evening shadows lengthened across the desert landscape, Clara realized that her life had become permanently intertwined with larger forces of justice and corruption. There could be no return to the simple poverty and obscurity that had defined her existence before Judge Whitfield's threats. But looking at Joseph's determined expression and feeling her own family's newfound strength, Clara discovered that she didn't want to return to that old life anyway. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as free people fighting for what was right. The federal marshal's plan was both elegant and dangerous. They would allow Morrison to proceed with the arrest warrant, but under carefully controlled circumstances that would expose the entire conspiracy. Joseph would submit to arrest voluntarily, demonstrating his confidence in the legal system while giving the marshals time to trace the warrant's origins back to its true source. Clara found herself assigned a crucial role in the operation. As Someone with intimate knowledge of Judge Whitfield's methods and connections, she would work with Federal Marshal Catherine Hayes to identify the local accomplices who had facilitated Morrison's mission. Marshal Hayes was unlike any woman Clara had ever encountered. Tall and confident, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, she carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect in a man's world. Her presence in Millbrook had already caused considerable gossip among townspeople who had never seen a female federal officer. "Miss Thompson," Marshal Hayes said as they met in the hotel's small dining room, "your cooperation in this investigation has been invaluable. But I need you to understand that what we are asking you to do next carries significant personal risk." Clara sat across from the Marshal, acutely aware that this conversation would determine the course of her immediate future. "What exactly do you need me to do?" "Judge Whitfield has been under house arrest, but he's still receiving visitors. We believe he's coordinating with his confederates through these meetings, planning additional moves to sabotage our investigation. We need someone who can get close enough to observe these meetings without arousing suspicion." The request was sobering. Clara would essentially be spying on a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to destroy lives to achieve his goals. If he discovered her activities, the consequences could be fatal. "How would I get close to him?" Clara asked. Marshal Hayes spread several documents across the table. "Judge Whitfield has requested permission to speak with you privately. He claims he wants to apologize for his behavior and discuss financial compensation for your family's suffering. It's obviously a trap, but it's also an opportunity." Clara studied the official request letter, written in Whitfield's precise handwriting. Even under house arrest, he maintained the formal courtesies that masked his true nature. The letter expressed regret for misunderstandings and emphasized his desire to make amends through appropriate financial arrangements. "He's trying to buy my silence," Clara realized, "or find out what I know about the federal investigation." "Precisely. But if you're willing to wear a wire device, we can turn his attempt at manipulation into evidence of witness tampering and conspiracy." Marshal Hayes produced a small mechanical device from her briefcase. "This recording apparatus can capture conversations clearly enough to serve as evidence in federal court." The technology was fascinating and terrifying. Clara had never imagined that conversations could be secretly recorded and used as evidence. The implications for privacy and personal security were staggering, but so was the potential for exposing corruption that might otherwise remain hidden. "What about my safety during the meeting?" Clara asked. "Deputy Marshal Carson will be positioned outside Whitfield's house, and Joseph will be nearby despite his arrest status. If anything goes wrong, help will be immediate." Marshal Hayes paused, studying Clara's expression. "But I won't lie to you. There are risks we can't completely control." Clara thought about her family's situation just a week ago, when they had faced starvation or forced marriage as their only options. The current danger seemed almost manageable by comparison, especially since she would be choosing it rather than having it imposed upon her. "When would this meeting take place?" she asked. "Tomorrow afternoon. Whitfield is expecting an answer to his request by noon." That evening, Clara found herself walking along the creek with Joseph, both of them aware that the coming days would test everything they had built together. The sunset painted the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson, creating a beauty that seemed to mock the human struggles playing out against its backdrop. "Are you certain about tomorrow's meeting?" Joseph asked. "Once you're inside Whitfield's house, I won't be able to protect you if something goes wrong." Clara appreciated his concern, but she had made her decision. "You protected me when I couldn't protect myself. Now I have the chance to help protect others from the same corruption that nearly destroyed my family. I have to take it." Joseph stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "Clara, there's something I need to tell you before tomorrow. Something that might change how you think about our situation. The seriousness in his voice made Clara's heart race with apprehension. What is it? The federal investigation will conclude within the next few weeks. When it's finished, I'll be returning to my people in the mountains. The Apache Tribal Council has voted to relocate our winter camp farther from white settlements to avoid future conflicts. The news hit Clara like a physical blow. She had known that Joseph's presence in Millbrook was temporary, but she had avoided thinking about what would happen when the investigation ended. Now faced with the reality of his departure, she realized how much his friendship had come to mean to her. "How far will you be moving?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Several days' ride into the high country. Far enough that casual. Contact with white settlements would be difficult." Joseph's expression was carefully neutral, but Clara sensed deeper emotions beneath the surface. "My father is old, and the tribal council believes that isolation is our best protection against future persecution." Clara understood the practical wisdom of the decision, but it filled her with a sense of loss that surprised her with its intensity. In Joseph, she had found not just a protector, but a person whose perspective had expanded her understanding of the world. The thought of losing that connection felt like losing part of herself. "Will I see you again after the investigation ends?" she asked quietly. Joseph's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "Clara, my people and yours live in different worlds. The events of the past week have brought those worlds together temporarily, but they'll separate again once the crisis passes." "What if they don't have to separate?" Clara asked, voicing a thought that had been growing in her mind for days. "What if there are people who can bridge those worlds?" Before Joseph could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Danny came running toward them, his face showing the same alarm that had preceded Morrison's arrival. Days earlier, "Clara, Joseph, you need to come quickly. There's been an explosion at Judge Whitfield's house." They rushed toward town, joining a stream of residents, hurrying toward the billowing smoke that rose from the direction of Whitfield's neighborhood. As they drew closer, Clara could see flames engulfing the judge's study while townspeople formed bucket brigades to prevent the fire from spreading to adjacent buildings. Federal Marshal Hayes appeared through the smoke, her face grim with frustration. Someone threw dynamite through Whitfield's study window. The explosion destroyed his personal papers and nearly killed him. "Is he alive?" Clara asked. "Barely. The doctor is treating him for burns and smoke inhalation, but he's unconscious and may not survive." Hayes surveyed the burning building with professional assessment. This wasn't random violence. Someone wanted to destroy evidence before Whitfield could be pressured into revealing his Confederates. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Just as the federal investigation was preparing to extract crucial information from Judge Whitfield, someone had attempted to silence him permanently while destroying any documentary evidence. Of the conspiracy, Joseph studied the scene with tactical awareness. This changes everything. If Whitfield dies, the investigation loses its primary witness. If he survives, but his records are destroyed, proving the conspiracy becomes much more difficult. "Unless we can find other sources of evidence," Marshal Hayes said pointedly, "which brings us back to tomorrow's planned meeting. Obviously, that's no longer possible, but there may be other options." Clara felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. The cancellation of her dangerous mission to spy on Whitfield eliminated immediate personal risk, but it also removed a crucial opportunity to gather evidence against the conspiracy. "What other options do we have?" she asked. Marshal Hayes exchanged glances with Joseph before answering. "Morrison and his men are still in town, presumably waiting for instructions from whoever hired them. If we can't get evidence from Whitfield directly, we might be able to get it from Morrison's employers by forcing them to reveal themselves. The plan that emerged over the next hour was even more dangerous than the original scheme. Joseph would allow himself to be taken into Morrison's custody, but instead of submitting to transfer to Arizona, he would attempt to escape during transport. The escape would be staged to look genuine, while actually being carefully coordinated with federal marshals who would follow at a distance. The goal is to force Morrison to contact his real employers for instructions, Marshal Hayes explained. When a federal prisoner escapes, there are specific protocols that legitimate bounty hunters follow. If Morrison deviates from those protocols, it will prove he's working for someone else. Clara saw the flaws in the plan immediately. What if Morrison just kills Joseph during the escape attempt? Dead prisoners can't testify about conspiracies. That's a risk we'll have to manage carefully, Joseph replied, but it may be our only chance to expose the people behind this conspiracy before they disappear entirely. The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Williams, who emerged from Whitfield's house with soot-stained clothes and a grave expression. The judge is stable for now, but he suffered serious injuries. Even if he survives, he may not be coherent enough to provide testimony for weeks. The news confirmed that the conspiracy's attempt to silence Whitfield had at least partially succeeded. Whether or not the judge survived, his ability to expose his confederates had been severely compromised. As the fire was finally brought under control, Clara found herself studying the faces of the townspeople who had gathered to watch. Someone among them had information about who was behind the explosion. Someone had seen or heard something that could break the case open, but identifying that person would require a different kind of investigation. Marshal Hayes, Clara said, what if we approach this from a different angle? Instead of trying to extract information from Morrison or Whitfield, what if we focused on the people in town who helped coordinate the conspiracy? The marshal looked interested. What do you have in mind? I've lived in Millbrook for 3 years. I know who has money, who has connections, who talks to whom. If there's a local network supporting this conspiracy, I might be able to identify its members through their behavior and associations. It was a long shot, but it offered a way to continue the investigation without putting Joseph in immediate mortal danger. Clara had already demonstrated her courage and analytical abilities. Now she was volunteering to use her local knowledge as a weapon against corruption. Joseph looked at her with obvious admiration and concern. Clara, that would require you to investigate some of the most powerful people in the territory. If they realize what you're doing, then I'll have to be very careful not to let them realize it, Clara replied. But someone has to try. We can't let these people destroy evidence and escape justice just because they're willing to use violence and intimidation. As they walked back toward the cabin where Clara's family was staying, she realized that her life had fundamentally changed in ways that went far beyond escaping forced marriage. She was no longer simply a victim of circumstances beyond her control. She had become an active participant in a struggle for justice that would shape the future of the entire territory. The stars were emerging in the desert sky as they reached the cabin, and Clara found herself wondering what the morning would bring. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with courage gained through adversity and purpose forged in the fires of injustice. But first, she needed to prepare for a kind of investigation that would test all her skills of observation and deduction. The people behind the conspiracy had revealed their desperation through tonight's violence. Now Clara would discover whether that desperation had also revealed their identities. Clara's investigation into the local conspiracy began at dawn the next morning. Armed with a notebook and her intimate knowledge of Millbrook's social dynamics, she set out to map the connections between Judge Whitfield and the town's most influential residents. Her strategy was simple but dangerous. Observe, listen, and document everything while maintaining the appearance of a young woman going about normal daily activities. Her first stop was Henderson's general store, where she had worked before the federal investigation began. The early morning rush provided perfect cover for eavesdropping on conversations between customers who assumed she was simply another townsperson running errands. "Terrible business about the judge's house," Mrs. Patterson was saying to her neighbor, as they selected fabric from the store's limited inventory. Though some might say he brought it on himself, getting involved with federal marshals and such. "Federal marshals have no business in territorial affairs," replied Mrs. Coleman, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose husband served on the town council. "Mark my words, this interference will bring nothing but trouble to decent people." Clara pretended to examine bolts of cloth while mentally cataloguing the conversation. Mrs. Coleman's husband owned the largest ranch in the county and had been one of Judge Whitfield's most frequent visitors during the months before Clara's forced engagement. If there was a local conspiracy, Coleman would likely be involved. Her observations were interrupted when Mr. Henderson approached with obvious nervousness. "Clara, I'm glad to see you're well, but I should mention that several prominent citizens have expressed concern about your continued presence in town. They feel your association with the federal investigation might be problematic for community harmony." The warning was politely phrased but unmistakably clear. Powerful people wanted her gone. Clara thanked Henderson for his concern, while making a mental note that the pressure to silence her was intensifying. Her next destination was the bank, where she hoped to observe interactions between Morrison's men and local financial institutions. Bounty hunters operating legitimately would need to access funds through proper banking channels. Any deviation from normal procedures might indicate corruption. The Millbrook Territorial Bank occupied a substantial brick building that projected stability and prosperity in a town where most structures were built from wood and adobe. Clara positioned herself on a bench across the street, ostensibly waiting for the stagecoach while actually watching the bank's entrance. Her patience was rewarded when Morrison himself emerged from the building, followed by a well-dressed man. Clara recognized as Vincent Sterling, the bank's president. The two men spoke briefly on the steps before Sterling handed Morrison a leather portfolio that clearly contained documents or money. Clara's pulse quickened with excitement and fear. Sterling was one of the territory's most respected financiers, a man whose reputation had never been touched by scandal. If he was involved in the conspiracy, it meant the corruption reached much higher levels than anyone had suspected. Morrison's next stop was even more revealing. He rode directly to the Coleman Ranch, where he was met by both Councilman Coleman and two other men Clara didn't recognize. The group gathered near the ranch's main corral, where their animated discussion suggested urgent planning rather than casual conversation. Clara realized she needed to get closer to hear their conversation, but approaching the ranch without being seen would be extremely difficult. The desert landscape offered little cover, and her presence would be impossible to explain if she were discovered. Her dilemma was solved by an unexpected ally. Danny appeared beside her, leading a borrowed horse and carrying fishing equipment that provided perfect justification for being in the area. "Thought you might need help," he said quietly. "Joseph sent me. He's tracking Morrison's men from the north while you watch from here." Clara felt a surge of gratitude for Joseph's tactical thinking. By coordinating their surveillance, they could gather more comprehensive intelligence while maintaining safety through mutual support. "Can you get close enough to hear what they're saying?" Clara asked her brother. Danny grinned with boyish confidence. "I've been sneaking up on rabbits and deer for years. A bunch of adults standing in the open should be easy." As Danny crept toward the ranch buildings, Clara maintained her position as lookout. The conversation at the corral was clearly reaching some kind of conclusion, with Morrison nodding emphatically as Coleman gestured toward the mountains where Apache territory began. When Danny returned 20 minutes later, his face was pale. with the importance of what he had overheard. Clara, they're not just trying to stop the federal investigation. They're planning something much worse. The intelligence Danny had gathered was shocking in its scope and brutality. The conspiracy extended far beyond simple corruption into a coordinated campaign to eliminate federal authority in the territory entirely. Coleman and his associates were planning to use Morrison's men to attack the federal marshals, making it appear as though Apache raiders were responsible. They said something about teaching Washington that territorial affairs should be handled by territorial people, Danny reported. And Morrison mentioned that his men have Apache weapons and clothing to make the attack look authentic. Clara felt sick as she realized the implications. Not only would innocent federal officers be murdered, but the Apache people would be blamed for crimes they didn't commit. The resulting military retaliation could destroy Joseph's entire tribe. "When is this attack supposed to happen?" Clara asked urgently. "Tomorrow night, when the marshals are traveling to the next town for their investigation." Coleman said the attack would happen at Devil's Canyon, where they could control the scene and plant evidence afterward. Clara's mind raced through their options. They had to warn the federal marshals immediately, but they also needed to gather proof of the conspiracy that would stand up in court. Simply reporting the overheard conversation might not be enough to convince skeptical officials, especially when the accusations involved such prominent citizens. "Danny, ride back to town as fast as you can. Find Marshal Hayes and tell her exactly what you heard. Don't talk to anyone else, and make sure you're not followed." As her brother rode away, Clara realized that her own investigation had become much more dangerous. If Coleman and his associates suspected that their plans had been discovered, they would stop at nothing to prevent exposure. Her only advantage was that they still viewed her as a powerless young woman rather than a serious threat. Her assumption was tested sooner than expected. As she prepared to leave her observation post, 3 riders approached from the direction of the Coleman ranch. Even from a distance, she could see that they were armed and riding with the purposeful urgency of men on a mission. Clara's horse was fast, but not fast enough to outrun 3 determined pursuers across open desert. Her only hope was to reach the rocky terrain near Devil's Canyon, where she might be able to hide among the boulder formations until help arrived. The chase lasted nearly an hour, with Clara using every trick her father had taught her about desert survival and evasion. She led the pursuers through dry washes and around rock formations, always staying just ahead of their attempts to corner her. But her horse was tiring, and the men behind her showed no signs of giving up. Her salvation came from an unexpected source. As she rounded a bend in the canyon, she nearly collided with Joseph, who was waiting behind a large boulder with his bow drawn and ready. His presence transformed her desperate flight into a tactical situation where the pursuers suddenly found themselves at a disadvantage. 3 men, all armed with rifles, Clara reported breathlessly as she dismounted behind Joseph's position. Joseph's response was swift and decisive. He sent an arrow whistling past the lead rider's head, close enough to demonstrate his accuracy, without causing injury. The warning shot caused all 3 men to rein in their horses and seek cover among the rocks. "You're trespassing on Apache hunting grounds," Joseph called out in English, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon. "Leave now, and no harm will come to you. Stay and face the consequences." Clara realized that Joseph was deliberately reinforcing the narrative that this was Apache territory, making the men's presence appear more threatening than it actually was. The psychological warfare was effective. The 3 riders quickly retreated, rather than risk a confrontation with a skilled Apache warrior on his home ground. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Joseph turned to Clara with obvious relief and admiration. "Your brother delivered your message to Marshal Hayes. The federal marshals are already moving to counter the planned attack, but what you discovered today may have saved more than just their lives." Clara found herself trembling with delayed reaction to the danger she had just escaped. "Joseph, the conspiracy involves the bank president, the town council, and probably half the business leaders in the territory. How can we fight something that powerful?" Joseph's expression was grim, but determined. "The same way my people have always fought superior forces, by being smarter, faster, and more committed to justice than our enemies are to corruption." As they rode back toward town together, Clara reflected on how much her life had changed. Since that terrible morning when Judge Whitfield had first threatened her family, she had gone from victim to witness to active participant in a struggle that would determine the future of justice in the territory. But the most significant change was in her relationship with Joseph. What had begun as gratitude for his intervention had evolved into something deeper and more complex. She found herself admiring not just his courage and skills, but his intelligence, his integrity, and his vision of a world where different peoples could coexist with mutual respect. "Joseph," she said as they paused at the creek where they had first talked, "what will happen to us after this investigation ends? I mean, personally?" Joseph's answer revealed that he had been wrestling with the same question. "Clara, my feelings? For you have grown beyond what I expected or intended. But I won't ask you to abandon your world for mine, and I can't abandon my responsibilities to my people for anyone, even someone I care about deeply." Clara understood the painful truth in his words. Their relationship existed in a space between two cultures, sustained by extraordinary circumstances that wouldn't last forever. When the federal investigation concluded and normal life resumed, the forces that divided their peoples would reassert themselves. "What if there was a way to serve both our peoples while staying together?" Clara asked. "The federal government will need people who understand both cultures to help prevent future conflicts. Maybe there's a role for people like us who can bridge different worlds." Joseph's eyes showed hope mixed with caution. "It would be dangerous work, constantly traveling between communities that might not trust our divided loyalties, and there would be no guarantee of success or safety." Clara smiled, with determination that reminded Joseph of the courage she had shown throughout their entire acquaintance. "I've learned that safety is an illusion. The only real security comes from fighting for what's right, regardless of the personal cost." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. This time, however, the visitors were Marshal Hayes and a squadron of federal officers, their faces showing the satisfaction of a successful operation. "Miss Thompson, Mr. Crowfeather," Marshal Hayes called as she dismounted, "I'm pleased to report that we've arrested Morrison and 3 of his men attempting to acquire Apache weapons from a corrupt arms dealer. Your intelligence about their plans allowed us to catch them in the act." Clara felt a surge of relief and accomplishment. "What about Coleman and the other conspirators?" "Sterling and Coleman have been taken into custody on charges of conspiracy and sedition. When faced with evidence of their involvement, several other participants decided to cooperate with the investigation rather than face federal prosecution. The news marked a turning point in the entire affair. The conspiracy that had seemed so powerful and untouchable just hours earlier was collapsing as its members chose self-preservation over loyalty to their criminal enterprise. But Clara knew that this victory, significant as it was, represented only the beginning of a much larger struggle. Corruption and prejudice couldn't be eliminated through a single investigation, no matter how successful. Building a truly just society would require the sustained efforts of people willing to bridge the gaps between different communities and cultures. As the sun set over the desert landscape, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Clara realized that she was ready for that challenge. Whatever the future held, she would face it with courage, earned through adversity, and purpose forged in the fires of injustice. 3 weeks after the arrests of Coleman Sterling and their conspirators, Millbrook had settled into an uneasy peace. Judge Whitfield had survived his injuries but remained under federal custody, awaiting transport to territorial court where he would face charges that could result in decades of imprisonment. The town struggled to adapt to new leadership as federal appointees replaced the corrupt officials who had controlled local government for years. Clara found herself in an unexpected position of influence. Marshal Hayes had recommended her to the territorial governor as someone who understood both the practical needs of frontier communities and the legal requirements of federal oversight. The result was an offer that would change her life completely, a position as a federal liaison officer, working to prevent the kind of corruption and cultural conflict that had nearly destroyed Millbrook. The job would require extensive travel throughout the territory, mediating disputes between Apache tribes and white settlements, while ensuring that federal law was properly enforced. It was dangerous, difficult work that offered no guarantees of success or safety. It was also exactly what Clara had hoped for, when she dreamed of bridging the gap between different worlds. But accepting the position would mean leaving her family behind. At least temporarily. Her mother and Danny would be well provided for. The federal government had awarded them substantial compensation for their cooperation in the investigation, and several townspeople had offered employment opportunities that would ensure their security. Still, the decision weighed heavily on Clara's conscience. Joseph had received a similar offer from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, a newly created federal agency tasked with managing relations between tribal governments and territorial authorities. His legal education and cultural knowledge made him an ideal candidate for work that required both diplomatic skills and deep understanding of Apache traditions. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Their individual talents and experiences, shaped by conflict and adversity, had prepared them for roles that might help prevent others from suffering similar hardships. But accepting those roles would require them to work together in ways that challenged the social conventions of both their cultures. On a warm afternoon in late autumn, Clara and Joseph met at the creek where they had shared so many important conversations. The cottonwood trees had turned golden with the changing season, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze that carried the scent of sage and pine from the distant mountains. "Have you decided about the federal position?" Joseph asked as they walked along the familiar path. Clara nodded slowly. "I'm going to accept it. The work is too important to turn down, and I've learned that I'm stronger than I thought I was. What about you?" "The Apache Council has given me permission to work with the federal government, but only if I can maintain my connections to our people and their needs. It's a difficult balance, serving two masters who don't always want the same things." They paused at the bend in the creek, where wildflowers still bloomed despite the advancing season. Clara had come to think of this spot as sacred in its own way, a place where two very different people had learned to understand and respect each other across cultural boundaries that seemed insurmountable to most of their contemporaries. "Joseph," Clara said carefully, "if we both accept these positions, we'll be working together frequently. People in both our communities will have opinions about that relationship." Joseph's expression showed that he had been thinking about the same issue. "Some will disapprove, maybe violently. Apache warriors who marry outside the tribe sometimes face exile. White women who associate too closely with Indians face different but equally serious consequences." Clara had witnessed enough prejudice and violence to understand the risks they would face, but she had also learned that some challenges were worth confronting, regardless of personal cost. "What if we didn't worry about what other people think?" she asked. "What if we focused on doing work that matters and let our actions speak for themselves?" Joseph smiled with the warmth that had first drawn Clara to him, despite their cultural differences. "Are you suggesting that we scandalize both our peoples simultaneously?" "I'm suggesting that we live according to our own values instead of other people's fears," Clara replied. "We've already proven that Apache and white people can work together for justice. Maybe it's time to prove that they can build a life together." And well, the conversation that followed was one of the most important of Clara's life. They discussed practical concerns, like where they would live, how they would navigate the social hostility their relationship would generate, and what kind of future they could build in a world that didn't have established patterns for couples like them. But beneath the practical considerations lay deeper questions about identity, loyalty, and the possibility of creating something new from the fusion of different traditions. Clara found herself imagining a life that combined the best aspects of both cultures while rejecting the prejudices and limitations that kept people trapped in cycles of conflict and misunderstanding. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Danny, who had been searching for Clara with news from town. His face showed excitement mixed with concern as he approached their secluded meeting place. "Clara, there are federal officials in town asking to speak with you and Joseph. They say it's about your new positions, but they seem more urgent than official business usually gets." Clara and Joseph exchanged glances, both recognizing that their peaceful interlude was about to end. They had learned to be suspicious of unexpected urgency, especially when it involved federal authorities who should have been following established procedures. The ride back to town revealed the source of the officials' urgency. A stagecoach waited outside the hotel, surrounded by armed guards who suggested that whatever mission had brought these men to Millbrook was considered extremely important by their superiors in the territorial capital. Marshal Hayes met them at the hotel entrance, her expression grave with the weight of new responsibilities. "Clara, Joseph, I'm glad you're here. We have a situation that requires immediate attention from people with your particular skills and knowledge." Inside the hotel's small dining room, they were introduced to Colonel Marcus Webb, a career military officer whose bearing suggested extensive experience with frontier conflicts. Beside him sat Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a woman whose presence surprised Clara. Federal officials rarely included women in important meetings, especially those involving military matters. "Miss Thompson, Mr. Crow Feather," Colonel Webb began without preamble, "we've received reports of potential Indian uprising in the Northern Territories. Apache bands have been leaving their designated reservations, and several settlements have reported increased raiding activity." Clara felt a chill of premonition. Apache people didn't abandon their territories without serious provocation, and the timing seemed suspicious, given the recent success of their anti-corruption investigation. Joseph's response was immediate and sharp. "Which Apache bands? Which reservations? And what evidence do you have that the movements you've observed are preparation for uprising rather than normal seasonal migration?" Dr. Morrison answered, consulting notes from a leather portfolio. "The Mescalero and Jicarilla bands from reservations in New Mexico Territory. Agency officials report that nearly half the registered tribal members have disappeared over the past month, taking weapons and supplies." The information was alarming, but Clara sensed that crucial details were being omitted. Federal officials didn't travel with armed escorts simply to discuss routine tribal movements, no matter how concerning those movements might be. "What aren't you telling us?" Clara asked directly. "What's the real reason you've come here?" Colonel Webb's expression showed reluctant respect for her directness. 3 days ago, a wagon train was attacked near the Colorado border. 15 people killed, including women and children. The attackers used Apache weapons and tactics, but something about the attack doesn't fit normal patterns of tribal warfare. Joseph leaned forward intently. What kind of inconsistencies? The attackers took no prisoners, which is unusual for Apache raids. They also left behind valuable supplies that would normally be taken as spoils of war. Most importantly, they made no attempt to conceal their identity, almost as if they wanted to be recognized as Apache warriors. Clara felt the pieces of a new puzzle beginning to form in her mind. You think someone is impersonating Apache raiders to justify military retaliation against the tribes? Dr. Morrison nodded gravely. That's our working theory. If we're correct, we're looking at a conspiracy to provoke an Indian war that could result in the deaths of thousands of innocent people on both sides. The implications were staggering. Someone with access to Apache weapons and knowledge of tribal tactics was orchestrating false attacks to create justification for military action against the reservations. The recent success of the anti-corruption investigation had clearly not eliminated all the dangerous elements in the territory. "What do you need from us?" Joseph asked, though Clara suspected he had already guessed the answer. Colonel Webb spread a map across the table, marking locations where suspicious activity had been reported. "We need investigators who can move freely in both white and Apache communities, gathering intelligence about who might be behind these false flag operations. Your recent work in Millbrook proved that you're capable of exposing complex conspiracies." Clara studied the marked locations, noting patterns that suggested careful planning rather than random violence. This isn't the work of a few rogue individuals. Someone with significant resources and organizational ability is coordinating these attacks. "Which brings us to our primary concern," Dr. Morrison said. Several of the men arrested in the Millbrook conspiracy were released on bail pending trial. Some of those men had extensive connections to military contractors and Indian agency officials. The revelation cast their recent victory in a different light. Instead of ending the corruption, they had merely exposed one layer of a much deeper and more dangerous conspiracy. The forces they had defeated in Millbrook had regrouped and escalated their activities to a level that threatened entire communities. Joseph's expression showed the controlled anger that Clara had learned to recognize as his response to injustice. "How long do we have before the military takes action against the reservations?" 2 weeks, possibly less," Colonel Webb replied. "Washington is under tremendous pressure to respond forcefully to what appears to be coordinated Apache aggression. If we can't prove that these attacks are being staged by imposters, the army will have no choice but to assume their genuine tribal warfare." Clara realized that accepting the federal positions they had been offered was no longer a choice about their future careers. It had become an emergency assignment with the lives of thousands of people hanging in the balance. "Where do we start?" she asked. Dr. Morrison produced additional documents from her portfolio. "We've identified 3 possible centers of conspiracy activity. One is in Santa Fe, where territorial officials have been pressuring Washington for increased military presence. Another is at Fort Union, where certain officers have been advocating for aggressive action against the reservations." "And the third?" Joseph asked. Colonel Webb's expression darkened. "Here in Millbrook, some of the men who were released on bail have been meeting regularly with visitors from other territories. We believe they're planning something that will make the fake wagon train attack look like a minor incident." Clara felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders once again. Just when she had thought their ordeal was over, they were being called upon to prevent an even greater catastrophe. But looking at Joseph's determined expression, she realized that they had been preparing for this moment throughout their entire relationship. "We'll take the assignment," she said firmly, "but we do this as equal partners, not as subordinates to federal authority. Our methods may not always align with official procedures." Colonel Webb nodded slowly. "Given your track record, I think we can accept some unconventional approaches. The alternative is a war that could destroy everything we've been trying to build in this territory." As the meeting concluded and preparations began for their new mission, Clara found herself reflecting on the circular nature of their situation. They had fought corruption to protect innocent people, only to discover that the same corrupt forces were now threatening even greater violence and injustice. But this time, they wouldn't be fighting alone or from a position of powerlessness. They had allies, resources, and most importantly, they had each other. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as partners in both work and life, bridging the gaps between different worlds while building something entirely new from the strength of their shared commitment to justice. The investigation into the false flag attacks led Clara and Joseph deep into the heart of territorial politics, where they discovered a conspiracy that reached far beyond anything they had encountered in Millbrook. Working undercover as a married couple conducting geological surveys, they traveled between remote settlements and Apache camps, gathering evidence of a coordinated campaign to provoke warfare that would justify massive land seizures and military contracts worth millions of dollars. Their cover story provided perfect justification for their presence in sensitive areas while allowing them to observe interactions between supposed enemies who were actually working together. Clara posed as a geologist's wife, documenting mineral deposits, while Joseph served as their Apache guide, a role that gave him access to both white and Indian communities without arousing suspicion. The deception required them to maintain their fictional marriage in public while navigating the genuine feelings that had developed between them. Sharing hotel rooms and presenting themselves as husband and wife forced them to confront the reality of their relationship in ways that abstract discussions about the future had not. This pretense is becoming more real than either of us expected. Clara observed one evening as they reviewed their notes in a Santa Fe hotel room. 3 weeks of investigation had revealed a network of corruption that included territorial governors, military contractors, and federal officials who were supposed to be protecting Apache rights. Joseph looked up from the map where he had been, marking locations of suspicious activity. "Is that a problem for you?" Clara considered the question carefully. Their fake marriage had revealed how naturally they worked together, how their different perspectives strengthened their joint capabilities, and how much she had come to value his presence in her daily life. "The only problem is that it's not real," she said quietly. "We're investigating people who are willing to murder hundreds of innocent individuals for money and power. I've learned that life is too uncertain to waste time pretending that our feelings don't matter." The conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking on their door. Joseph moved to answer it with the caution that had become second nature during their dangerous mission, while Clara gathered their documents and prepared for the possibility of hasty departure. The visitor was Dr. Morrison, whose presence in Santa Fe meant that their investigation had reached a critical juncture. Her face showed the strain of someone carrying terrible knowledge that demanded immediate action. "We've intercepted communications that indicate the final phase of the conspiracy. We'll begin tomorrow," she said without preamble. "A fake Apache attack on the territorial capital designed to kill key federal officials and create justification for total war against all tribal reservations." Clara felt ice form in her veins. "How many people are we talking about?" "Potentially thousands. The attack is planned to coincide with a territorial assembly meeting where federal representatives will be present. If it succeeds, Washington will have no choice but to authorize massive military retaliation against every Apache band in the Southwest." Joseph studied the intelligence documents Dr. Morrison had brought, his expression growing darker with each detail. The weapons, the tactics, even the war paint patterns, everything has been researched to create a perfect impersonation of Apache raiders. Whoever planned this has extensive knowledge of our culture. Clara recognized the strategic brilliance of the conspiracy, even as she was horrified by its implications. By targeting federal officials during a territorial meeting, the conspirators would eliminate the people most likely to investigate the authenticity of the attack while creating political pressure for immediate military response. "What's our role in stopping this?" Clara asked. Dr. Morrison spread additional maps across the hotel room table. "The attack will involve approximately 30 men disguised as Apache warriors. They'll approach the capital from the east, following traditional raiding routes to make their presence appear authentic. Your job is to intercept them and gather evidence of their true identities before they can complete their mission." The assignment was essentially a death sentence. 30 armed men who had trained for months to impersonate Apache warriors wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who threatened to expose their mission. Clara and Joseph would be outnumbered 15-1, with no backup and minimal equipment. "There has to be another way," Joseph said. "Direct confrontation with those odds would be suicide." Clara studied the maps, looking for tactical alternatives that might give them a chance of success. What if we didn't try to stop them directly? What if we focused on exposing their deception to the people they're planning to attack? Dr. Morrison looked interested. "Explain." "The attack depends on everyone believing that genuine Apache warriors are responsible. If we can prove that the raiders are imposters before they attack, the entire conspiracy collapses. The territorial officials will be looking for Apache raiders, not white men in disguise." Joseph immediately grasped the implications of Clara's strategy. "We intercept the raiding party before they reach the capital, document their true identities, then race ahead to warn the territorial assembly. When the attack comes, everyone will be prepared to see through the deception." It was still extraordinarily dangerous, but it offered better odds than direct confrontation with superior numbers. More importantly, it focused on exposure and prevention rather than violence, aligning with their shared commitment to justice, through truth rather than force. Dr. Morrison nodded slowly. "The plan has merit, but the timing will be critical. You'll have less than 24 hours to locate the raiding party, gather proof of their deception, and reach the capital before they do." Clara felt the familiar mixture of fear and determination that had characterized every crisis they had faced together. "Then we'd better get started." The next 18 hours tested every skill they had developed during their partnership. Using Joseph's knowledge of traditional Apache travel routes and Clara's analytical abilities, they tracked the fake raiding party across 50 miles of desert terrain, staying close enough to observe their activities while remaining undetected. The evidence they gathered was overwhelming. The supposed Apache warriors spoke English among themselves, carried manufactured weapons instead of traditional arms, and displayed war paint patterns that mixed symbols from different tribes in ways that no genuine Apache would ever use. Most damning of all, their leader was Vincent Sterling, the bank president from Millbrook, who had supposedly been arrested weeks earlier. "He must have been released on bail and assumed dead or fled," Clara whispered as they observed the camp. "From a rocky outcrop. No one would be looking for him this far from Millbrook." Joseph was documenting the raiders' faces and equipment with the thoroughness of someone who understood that their observations might be the only evidence available to prevent a catastrophic war. "Sterling isn't just participating in this attack. He's leading it. This entire conspiracy may have been his creation from the beginning." As dawn approached, Clara and Joseph began their race to reach the territorial capital before the raiding party could complete their mission. Riding hard across terrain that punished both horses and riders, they covered ground with the desperate urgency of people carrying the fate of thousands in their saddlebags. They reached Santa Fe 2 hours before the fake raiders were scheduled to arrive, giving them just enough time to present their evidence to territorial officials who were initially skeptical of their claims. Only the intervention of Dr. Morrison and Colonel Webb convinced the assembly to take their warning seriously. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything Clara had ever witnessed. When Sterling's raiders attacked the territorial building, they found armed guards waiting for them instead of surprised officials. The carefully planned deception unraveled within minutes as the attackers were forced to reveal their true identities under pressure. Sterling himself was captured alive, along with enough of his men to provide testimony that exposed the entire conspiracy. The evidence included financial records showing payments from military contractors, correspondence with corrupt federal officials, and detailed plans for land seizures that would have followed the anticipated Indian War. But the victory came at a personal cost that Clara hadn't anticipated. During the final confrontation, Joseph had been wounded while protecting territorial officials from Sterling's last desperate attempt at assassination. The bullet had lodged near his shoulder, requiring surgery that left him unconscious for nearly 24 hours. Clara spent those hours beside his bed in the territorial hospital, facing the possibility that she might lose the person who had become the center of her world. Their fake marriage had evolved into genuine partnership, and partnership had grown into love that transcended the cultural boundaries that still divided their peoples. When Joseph finally regained consciousness, Clara was holding his hand while reading aloud from a letter that had arrived from her mother in Millbrook. Danny had been accepted to a territorial school where he would receive the education their father had always wanted for him. Her mother had found work with a family that appreciated her skills and treated her with respect rather than charity. "Your family is thriving," Joseph said weakly, his voice still affected by the surgery. "They don't need you to sacrifice your happiness for their security anymore." Clara looked into his dark eyes and saw the same love and commitment she felt, tempered by the same concerns about the practical challenges their relationship would face. "Joseph, I've learned something important during these past months. Home isn't a place or a people. It's wherever you can be yourself while working for something meaningful." The conversation that followed settled the question that had been growing between them since their first meeting. They would marry in reality, not just as cover for federal investigations. They would build a life that honored both their backgrounds while creating something new from their shared commitment to justice and understanding. The wedding ceremony took place 3 months later in the same church where Judge Whitfield had attempted to force Clara into marriage. But this time, the building was filled with people who celebrated the union as a symbol of hope rather than witnessing it as a tragedy. Clara's family was there, along with federal officials who had worked with them during the investigation. Joseph's Apache relatives had traveled from the mountains to participate in a ceremony that blended Christian and Apache traditions in ways that reflected the couple's determination to bridge different worlds. Marshal Hayes served as Clara's witness, while Chief Running Bear, Joseph's grandfather, performed traditional Apache blessings alongside the Christian ceremony conducted by Reverend Morrison. The service itself became a demonstration of how different cultures could collaborate without losing their individual identities. But the most meaningful moment came when Clara and Joseph exchanged vows they had written together, promising not just personal fidelity, but shared commitment to building a territory where justice and understanding could flourish regardless of cultural background. "I promise to stand with you in fighting injustice wherever we find it," Clara said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed church. "I promise to honor your people's wisdom while sharing my own heritage, creating something new from the strength of our differences." Joseph's response reflected the diplomatic skills that had made him invaluable as a federal liaison. "I promise to protect and cherish you while working together for a future where our children can choose their own paths without being limited by the prejudices that once divided our peoples." The reception that followed demonstrated how much Millbrook had changed since the corruption investigation, Apache and white families shared food and conversation, their children playing together without the suspicion and fear that had once characterized such interactions. Even more significantly, several other couples had followed Clara and Joseph's example, creating relationships that crossed cultural boundaries. The territory was slowly developing a population of people who understood multiple perspectives and could serve as bridges between different communities. Dr. Morrison, who had been promoted to head the new Bureau of Cultural Relations, approached Clara and Joseph during the reception with news about their next assignment. The success of their work in preventing the fake Apache War had convinced federal authorities to establish permanent positions for investigators who could operate effectively in multicultural environments. "You'll be traveling throughout the Southwest, working to prevent the kind of conflicts that corruption and misunderstanding create," she explained. "It's dangerous work with no guaranteed outcomes, but it's also the most important job in the territory right now." Clara looked at Joseph, seeing her own excitement reflected in his expression. They had found their calling in work that mattered, surrounded by people who shared their values, building a life that honored both their individual heritage and their shared commitment to justice. 6 months after their wedding, Clara and Joseph established their base of operations in a small town, equidistant from Apache settlements and white farming communities. Their home became a meeting place where disputes could be resolved through dialogue rather than violence, where cultural exchanges strengthened understanding between different peoples. Danny had grown into a confident young man who spent summers working with Clara and Joseph, learning skills that would prepare him for similar work when he came of age. Clara's mother had remarried, choosing a kind widower who appreciated her strength and independence rather than trying to control her. Joyce's, even Judge Whitfield's story had reached a form of resolution. Sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, he had begun corresponding with Clara from his cell, slowly acknowledging the harm his corruption had caused and expressing genuine remorse for his attempts to force her into marriage. Clara had initially ignored his letters, but eventually began responding with careful encouragement for his efforts at rehabilitation. The correspondence had evolved into an unlikely mentorship, where Clara helped Whitfield understand how his actions had affected real people, while he provided insights into the systematic corruption that still plagued territorial government. On a warm evening in late spring, Clara and Joseph sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the desert landscape in brilliant colors. Their first year of marriage had been filled with challenges, adventures, and the deep satisfaction that came from work that made a genuine difference in people's lives. "Do you ever regret the choice we made?" Joseph asked, taking Clara's hand as they watched their neighbor's children play in the dusty street. Clara considered the question seriously. Their life was unconventional, sometimes dangerous, and frequently complicated by people who disapproved of their mixed marriage. But it was also filled with purpose, love, and the knowledge that they were building something meaningful together. "I regret that it took a crisis to bring us together," she said finally, "but I don't regret anything that's happened since then. We've proven that people from different worlds can build a life together without betraying their heritage or their principles." Joseph squeezed her hand gently. "And we've proven that love can grow from respect and shared values, even when it begins with circumstances neither person would have chosen." As the stars emerged in the desert sky, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her from a powerless young woman facing forced marriage to a confident federal investigator working to build a more just society. The transformation hadn't been easy, and it certainly hadn't been safe, but it had been authentic to her own values and choices. Most importantly, she had learned that true love wasn't about being rescued from difficult circumstances. It was about finding someone who would stand beside you as an equal partner while you faced life's challenges together, each person contributing their unique strengths to build something stronger than either could achieve alone. The cruel judge, who had tried to force her into marriage, had inadvertently set in motion events that led to genuine love, meaningful work, and a life filled with purpose. His corruption had been exposed, his victims had found justice, and the territory had taken important steps toward becoming a place where different peoples could coexist with mutual respect. As Clara and Joseph prepared for bed in the home they had built together, she understood that their story was really just beginning. They had established the foundation for a life dedicated to justice and understanding, but the work of building a better world would continue for the rest of their lives. And that was exactly how Clara wanted it to be. A life spent fighting for what was right, surrounded by people she loved, in partnership with someone who shared her commitment to making the world a better place for everyone, regardless of their background or the circumstances of their birth. The poor girl who had once faced forced marriage to a cruel judge had become a woman who chose her own destiny while helping others do the same. And in the end, that transformation was the greatest victory of all. But their story continued to unfold in ways that surprised even them. 2 years into their marriage, Clara discovered she was expecting their first child. The news brought both joy and new challenges, as they wondered how to raise a child who would belong to both cultures while being fully accepted by neither. The pregnancy also brought unexpected visitors to their door. Clara's father-in-law, Chief Running Bear, arrived with a delegation of Apache elders who had traveled for days to discuss the future of mixed heritage children in their communities. It was a conversation that had never needed to happen before, as marriages between Apache and white people were virtually unknown. "The child will be Apache," the chief declared firmly during their first meeting. "Our bloodline runs strong, and our ways must be preserved." Clara felt Joseph tense beside her, recognizing the challenge to their carefully balanced approach to cultural identity. "With respect, grandfather," Joseph replied, "the child will be both Apache and white. To deny either heritage would be to deny part of who they are." The discussion that followed lasted 3 days, with Clara and Joseph presenting their vision of raising children who could move freely between both worlds, serving as bridges rather than being forced to choose sides. Gradually, the Apache elders began to see the wisdom in this approach, especially when Clara demonstrated her knowledge of Apache customs and her genuine respect for their traditions. The compromise they reached became a model for other mixed families throughout the territory. The child would be raised with full knowledge of both heritages, spending summers with Apache relatives in the mountains and winters in white communities, learning the languages, customs, and wisdom of both peoples. When their daughter, Maria, Running Waters Thompson, was born on a crisp autumn morning, she was welcomed by both communities with ceremonies that blended Christian baptism and Apache naming rituals. Clara looked into her daughter's dark eyes and saw the future of the territory, a generation that would grow up seeing cultural differences as sources of strength rather than division. The birth also brought a surprise visitor. Sheriff Bradley arrived from Millbrook with news that Judge Whitfield had been released from prison after serving only 3 years of his sentence. His early release had been secured through legal appeals and evidence of his cooperation with ongoing corruption investigations, but many people felt that justice had not been fully served. "He's asked to see you," Bradley told Clara. "Claims he has information about remaining corruption networks that only you would understand how to use." Clara's initial reaction was revulsion. The man who had tried to force her into marriage, who had threatened her family and corrupted an entire town, wanted to meet with her as if they were old friends. But Joseph suggested a different perspective. "Perhaps he's genuinely changed," Joseph said as they discussed the request. Prison can transform people, especially when they're forced to confront the harm they've caused. And if he really does have information that could help other victims, Clara realized that her response to Whitfield's request would test how completely she had moved beyond the trauma of their initial encounter. Meeting with him would require her to face her past, while demonstrating the strength and confidence she had developed through years of challenging work. The meeting took place in the parlor of their home, with Joseph present and Sheriff Bradley stationed outside. Whitfield entered looking far older than his years, his once imposing presence diminished by imprisonment and genuine remorse. His first words surprised Clara with their directness. "Miss Thompson, Mrs. Crow Feather, I owe you an apology that can never adequately express the shame I feel for my actions. You were a child, and I was a powerful man who abused that power in ways that nearly destroyed your life." Clara studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-serving calculation. Instead, she saw something she had never expected, genuine humility and regret that seemed to have aged him more than his years in prison. "I appreciate your apology, Judge Whitfield," she said carefully. "But Sheriff Bradley mentioned that you have information about ongoing corruption." Whitfield nodded, pulling out a leather folder filled with documents. "Prison gave me time to think about the network of corruption I had participated in. I wasn't the only judge taking bribes, and I wasn't the only official using intimidation to control people. The system I helped create is still operating, just more carefully hidden. The information he provided was detailed and damning. Names, dates, financial transactions, and methods of operation for a corruption network that extended throughout the territorial government. Most importantly, he had identified the key figures who had taken over operations after his arrest, continuing the same patterns of abuse and intimidation. "Why are you giving us this information?" Joseph asked. "What do you hope to gain?" Whitfield's answer surprised them both. "I hope to prevent other people from suffering the way I made you suffer. I can't undo my past actions, but I can try to ensure that the system that enabled those actions is finally destroyed." Clara found herself facing a moral complexity she hadn't anticipated. The man who had been her greatest enemy was now offering to become an ally in fighting the same corruption that had nearly destroyed her family. Accepting his help felt like a betrayal of her own suffering, but rejecting it might allow other innocent people to become victims. "What would you need from us?" she asked finally. "Protection," Whitfield said simply. "The people I'm exposing won't hesitate to kill me if they discover what I'm doing. And credibility, my word alone won't be enough to convince federal investigators. But your endorsement might give my information the weight it needs." The decision to work with Whitfield marked a new phase in Clara and Joseph's careers as federal investigators. Using his insider knowledge combined with their field experience, they uncovered and dismantled 3 major corruption networks over the following year, preventing countless acts of injustice and abuse. The work was emotionally challenging for Clara, requiring her to maintain professional relationships with a man who had once represented everything she feared and hated. But it also demonstrated the power of genuine redemption and the possibility that even the worst people could contribute to justice if they were willing to acknowledge their mistakes and work to correct them. Their success attracted attention from federal authorities in Washington, who offered them positions with the newly created Department of Justice. The work would require them to travel throughout the American West, investigating corruption and cultural conflicts in territories that were struggling with the same issues they had addressed in New Mexico. But before accepting the promotion, Clara and Joseph decided to return to Millbrook for one final visit. The town had changed dramatically. In the years since Judge Whitfield's downfall, new leadership had brought honest government, economic prosperity, and a level of cooperation between different cultural groups that served as a model for other communities. Their old cabin had been converted into a school where Apache and white children learned together, taught by teachers who understood the value of multiple perspectives. Clara's mother had become one of those teachers, using her experience raising children in different cultural contexts to help others navigate similar challenges. Danny, now 16 and preparing for territorial college, had grown into a confident young man who moved easily between Apache and white communities. His childhood experience of witnessing his sister's transformation had given him a deep understanding of justice and courage that would serve him well in whatever career he chose. The most significant change was in the people themselves. The fear and suspicion that had once characterized relationships between different groups had been replaced by curiosity and mutual respect. Children who had grown up seeing Clara and Joseph's successful marriage were creating their own cross-cultural friendships and partnerships. On their last evening in Millbrook, Clara and Joseph walked through the town where their story had begun. The church where Judge Whitfield had tried to force her into marriage now hosted regular community meetings where Apache and white families worked together on shared challenges. The creek, where they had shared so many important conversations, had been turned into a small park where children played games that combined elements from both cultures. The general store, where Clara had once worked as a near slave, now employed people from multiple backgrounds, paying fair wages and treating all workers with dignity. "We've created something neither of our peoples had before," Joseph observed, as they watched children playing together in the gathering dusk. "Not Apache, not white, but something new that honors both traditions while moving beyond their limitations." Clara adjusted the shawl around baby Maria, who was sleeping peacefully, despite the evening's activities. "I wonder what kind of world she'll grow up in. Will she face the same challenges we did, or will we have solved enough problems to give her different choices?" Joseph's answer reflected the hard-won wisdom they had gained through years of difficult work. "She'll face different challenges, but she'll face them with advantages we never had. She'll grow up knowing that people from different backgrounds can work together, that justice is possible, and that love can bridge any divide if both people are committed to building something together." As they prepared to leave Millbrook for their new assignment in Washington, Clara reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from powerless victim to confident federal investigator. The transformation hadn't been easy, and it certainly hadn't followed any path she could have imagined as a frightened 17-year-old facing forced marriage. But every challenge had taught her something valuable about courage, justice, and the power of people to change not just their own circumstances, but the entire world around them. Most importantly, she had learned that true strength came not from defeating enemies, but from transforming them into allies, not from destroying broken systems, but from building better ones. The poor girl who had once been forced to marry a cruel judge at gunpoint had become a woman who chose her own destiny while helping others do the same. Her story would continue in new places with new challenges, but it would always be grounded in the fundamental truth she had discovered in Millbrook, that love, justice, and understanding could overcome even the most entrenched hatred and corruption. And as their wagon carried them toward new adventures and responsibilities, Clara knew that the greatest victory wasn't in any single triumph over injustice, but in the ongoing work of building a world where no child would ever face the kind of powerless terror she had once experienced. That work would never be finished, but it would always be worth doing, especially when shared with someone who understood that true love meant standing together against whatever darkness the world might bring. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.